morning. That's your meeting. Hi everybody, I'm Griffin Reed, as you just heard, and my research and presentation is titled Eliminating Political Parties, an Examination of School Boards in Indiana and Alabama. So when we started, we were told to find a research question that we were interested in, and I did have trouble with that. So I started looking into teacher pay. That's what caught my interest, and it somehow got to school board elections. And I got curious because I was wondering, why do most school board elections do nonpartisan elections in Indiana, or in the United States, rather than partisan ones? We're also used to a partisan system. So that led me to the research question of to what extent do election systems impact fairness? So I'm just going to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. The literature review is the debate over partisan and nonpartisan elections. I came to that by just diving into a whole lot of Google Scholar and libraries. I found two schools of thought: the Republican Advantage School and the Nonpartisan Advantage School, which I'll get into momentarily. That led me to two hypotheses, and testing the hypotheses, analyzing the results, and eventually coming to the conclusions for the whole research. So with the literature review, as I said, I came up with two schools of thought: the Republican Advantage School and the Nonpartisan Advantage School. The Republican Advantage School started in 1952 with Charles Adrian. It was a response to a progressive era push towards nonpartisan elections from the 1920s. And he was just writing in response, talking about how nonpartisan elections benefit Republican-style candidates and the many ways that goes on. And then the nonpartisan advantage started with Charles Gilbert, who argued against the Republican Advantage School. So most of the nonpartisan advantage school of thought originates just from arguing the Republican advantage. And the nonpartisan advantage bases itself, obviously, in the benefits of a nonpartisan system. Through diving into the literature, I came up with two hypotheses here: null and an alternative, and a model. The model shows the correlation of an election system used with fairness of election and whether there is one or not. The two hypotheses: the null is the first one, stating that the election system used will not change the fairness of an election, and the alternative, that the election system used will change the fairness of an election. You can tell that from both schools of thought, both would obviously agree with the alternative hypothesis. So I had to test these hypotheses somehow, and so I investigated school board elections in Indiana and in Alabama. Those are my independent variables: the nonpartisan and partisan elections. Indiana has the nonpartisan elections, Alabama has partisan. The reason for choosing Alabama is because, as I said, nonpartisan elections or partisan elections are harder to come by in the United States, so I really had a small sample size of states to choose from, and Alabama, putting all things together, made the most sense out of those. The dependent variables are 4 different indexes that I coded and calculated through aspects of fairness, and 3 of those added together create the 4th one, and I'll get into that here in a moment. I then ran those index scores through an independent samples t-test in order to determine the significance of difference between between nonpartisan and partisan affiliation. So here's the raw data. This is I have a voter turnout index, which I just took the voter turnout percentage from the districts of these school boards in each state, and they came out to be the exact same. And I have reasons for that I'll explain later, that kind of made them a little bit irrelevant to the study. But where it gets important is I also have the competitive index, which is I took the probability of winning a seat based off how many members were running for it, how many seats were available. So that came up to a probability, and I got the mean of all the school district probabilities to create the competitiveness index. The incumbent index is almost done the exact same way, but instead of using candidates running for seats, I used incumbents that won seats, if that makes sense. And so that's how I got to my indexes. The SBE Fairness Index is the School Board Election Fairness Index. It was too long to write it aloud. So all of the indexes put together, all their means added together, come up with an overall fairness index of how fair the elections are. So from the raw data, it would appear that Indiana and nonpartisan elections would be more fair than Alabama and partisan elections. But we can't draw conclusions from raw data. We have to put it into an independent samples t-test. So I have highlighted in yellow the most important aspects of this t-test. The significance two-tailed for the C index, which is the competitiveness index, and the p-value for the significance two-tailed for the SBE index. The reason this is important is because it shows the significance of difference between the having a nonpartisan and a partisan election, whether or not having a system makes the difference on how fair they are. So having a 0.146 for SBE, which is overall what we're evaluating, would mean that 85.4% of the time we run the test, we would reject the null hypothesis when it is true. That sounds really high, but the threshold for rejecting a null hypothesis is 95%. So that would have had to have been a 0.05. So therefore, the study does fail to reject the null hypothesis, meaning that the election system used would not impact the fairness of an election based off of this study. Though I will say that 85.4% is relatively high, and with a larger sample size, it may yield results that would possibly reject the null hypothesis. The relevance of the C index that I showed you being 0.01 is because that means that 99% of the time, competitiveness ran through the t-test did have significant impact on competitiveness had significant impact on the election. So the election system used then would impact the competitiveness. So why does any of this matter? We were basically evaluating three different aspects of why it might matter. We were looking at scholars, policymakers, and citizens. So to the scholars, I pretty much found a dispute for both of their arguments. Both were arguing that nonpartisan and partisan elections would be more fair than the other one. I found that it doesn't make a difference. That either way, the study shows that fairness is not significantly impacted, though I would say it was impacted. I also think for scholars that it opens up a new measurement of study, along with the competitiveness index. I think is very important to the scholars. It gives them something else to base a new study off of and maybe dive deeper into that. For policymakers, it shows new modes of measurements for elections with the C index and the SBE index. Whether or not they would dive into that, I would go ahead and assume not. Whether or not nonpartisan or partisan elections are more fair, I can't say that policymakers are going to affect that at all. But citizens will, like the policymakers, likely remain complacent as long as there's no evidence to show that change needs to be made or that or doesn't need to be made, would not affect how they're acting. There are weaknesses to my study. Like I said, it would have benefited from a larger sample size. I did have a decent sample size, but I think an even larger one would have gotten me to, or gotten the study to results that would have possibly been more shocking or more eye-opening, I suppose. I also think a weakness would have been that I did it for the 2016 election because that's what yielded the most sample size. And as we all know, that was a very polarizing election and had record-breaking turnout. So I pretty much made my turnout, voter percentage turnout index almost not even valuable to the study. I think that if it were conducted somewhere else in a different study, a different year, you might have been able to try to find what the difference in voter turnout would have been for partisan and nonpartisan elections. Some other smaller weaknesses than those two would be that Alabama is one-party dominated. It's very heavily Republican. I think that after evaluating all the school boards, I think maybe one Democrat won a seat in the Alabama elections for school boards. So I think that could be a potential weakness because Indiana isn't quite as, we all know it is pretty far red, but we all know that it's not that far. Also, they have very different geographical and cultural differences that I would say I would prefer to use a state that probably would be a better fit for Indiana. For further study, I would say judicial elections would be a good start. They also have nonpartisan and partisan elections. The reason I didn't choose judicial elections was because, as I said, I was interested in teacher pay. This is kind of the way I went, but also because judicial elections have far less seats available than school boards, so I had a much smaller sample size than that. I would repurpose the same index for the C to just dive into way deeper studies for that, perhaps even perform the same study, find aspects of competitiveness, run the same study, but replace it with different aspects and see what comes out of that. And like I said earlier, just a larger sample size probably would have benefited me some. That is all I have, and here's my works cited, so I am open for questions. Yes?